Nebraska Territory, September 1859. The axe had belonged to their father, and that was the only reason Marcus Dunbar got to keep it. "Everything else stays," his older brother Cornelius said, standing in the doorway of the farmhouse like a guard protecting treasure. "The tools, the wagon, the livestock, all of it was father's, which means it's mine now. But that axe was always meant for you. He said so himself, back when you were still useful." Marcus stood in the yard, holding the worn hickory handle, feeling the weight of the steel head that their father had sharpened every Sunday morning for 30 years. The axe was a good one, well-maintained, perfectly balanced. It was also the only thing he owned in the world. "I worked this farm for 12 years, Marcus said, quietly. 12 years without wages, without thanks, without a single acre put in my name. And you're giving me an axe." "I'm giving you what Father wanted you to have. Be grateful." Cornelius's wife, Dorothy, appeared behind him, her face wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who had finally gotten what she wanted. She had never liked Marcus. Too quiet, too strange, too focused on his odd projects and experiments when he should have been focusing on profitable labor. For 3 years she had whispered in her husband's ear, and now those whispers had finally borne fruit. "There's no place for you here anymore," Dorothy said, not bothering to hide her pleasure. "Cornelius has a family to think about. We need the space, the resources. You understand." Marcus understood perfectly. He understood that his brother had always been weak, easily manipulated by whoever spoke loudest in his ear. He understood that Dorothy saw him as competition for an inheritance that should have been shared. He understood that 12 years of loyal work meant nothing when weighed against a scheming wife's ambitions. "Where am I supposed to go?" he asked, not expecting a useful answer. "West," Cornelius said. "There's land out there for anyone willing to work it. Free land, they say. You're young enough, strong enough. You'll figure something out." Marcus was 34 years old. Not young by frontier standards, but not old either. He had skills, carpentry, farming, animal husbandry, that should have made him valuable. But skills without tools were like seeds without soil. You couldn't grow anything from nothing. Except he wasn't starting with nothing. He had an axe. "Fine," Marcus said. "I'll go. But remember this day, Cornelius. Remember what you did to your own blood for the sake of a woman's greed." He turned and walked away before his brother could respond, the axe resting on his shoulder, his feet carrying him west toward land he'd never seen and a future he couldn't imagine. Behind him, the farmhouse door closed with a sound like a chapter ending. He walked for 11 days, following trails that other settlers had carved through the endless grass. The Nebraska Territory was nothing like the Ohio farm country where Marcus had spent his entire life. Here, the land stretched flat to the horizon in every direction, an ocean of grass that moved in waves when the wind blew. Trees were scarce, clustered along creek beds and river bottoms, precious resources in a landscape that seemed determined to deny them. Marcus had heard stories about the settlers who came to this country, how they built houses from cut sod because there wasn't enough timber for proper construction, how they burned dried buffalo dung because firewood was worth more than food, how they went mad from the emptiness and the wind that never stopped blowing. He had also heard stories about the ones who survived, the clever ones, the stubborn ones, the ones who looked at impossible circumstances and found solutions that no one else had considered. Marcus intended to be one of those. He found his spot on the 12th day, where a small creek cut through a low ridge that offered some protection from the north wind. The ridge wasn't much, maybe 15 feet high at its peak, but it was more elevation change than he'd seen in 100 miles. More importantly, The creek had carved a small grove of cottonwood trees into the landscape, perhaps 24 mature specimens that represented more lumber than most Nebraska settlers saw in a year. He made camp that night beside the creek, eating the last of the dried corn he'd carried from Ohio, watching the stars wheel overhead in a sky so vast it made him feel like a speck of dust on an infinite floor. "All right," he said to no one, to himself, to whatever force had guided him to this particular spot on the endless prairie. "Let's see what we can build with an axe and nothing else." The first week was about assessment, understanding what he had to work with and what he needed to survive. The creek provided water, reliable and clean, fed by springs somewhere upstream that kept it flowing even in the driest weather. The cottonwood grove provided timber, enough to build a shelter and still leave trees standing for future needs. The ridge provided protection from the worst of the wind, and its south-facing slope would catch winter sun when he needed warmth most. But the biggest challenge wasn't shelter or water or even food. The biggest challenge was firewood. Marcus had grown up in Ohio, where forests covered the hills and firewood was so abundant that people burned it carelessly, letting fires roar through chimneys while heat escaped through poorly sealed walls. Here in Nebraska, wood was precious. Every branch, every fallen limb, every scrap of timber represented hours of gathering and hauling from creek beds that might be miles away. And even when you had firewood, keeping it dry was nearly impossible. The prairie weather was unpredictable. Sunny skies could turn to driving rain in minutes, and rain that soaked your woodpile meant cold nights and smoky fires and misery that compounded with each passing day. He had watched other settlers struggle with this problem during his journey west. Their firewood stacks sat exposed to the elements, covered with canvas that blew away in storms or leaked through worn spots. They burned damp wood that smoked and sputtered, that produced half the heat of dry fuel, that coated their chimneys with creosote, that would eventually catch fire and burn their homes down around them. There had to be a better way. Marcus spent 3 days thinking about the problem, turning it over in his mind while his hands stayed busy with basic survival tasks. He thought about the root cellars back in Ohio, how they stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, how vegetables stored underground kept fresh for months, while the same produce left above ground rotted in weeks. Underground storage worked because the earth maintained a constant temperature and humidity, buffered from the wild swings that characterized the surface. What worked for vegetables might work for firewood. What kept potatoes from freezing might keep oak splits from soaking. On the 4th day, he started digging. The dugout took 3 weeks to complete, working alone with nothing but his axe, a shovel he fashioned from cottonwood and flat stones, and the stubborn determination that had always been his defining characteristic. He chose a spot on the south face of the ridge, where the slope was steep enough to provide natural drainage, but gentle enough to allow easy access. He cut into the hillside at a slight upward angle, so any water that did penetrate would flow out rather than pooling inside. The digging was brutal work, especially without proper tools. His improvised shovel broke twice before he figured out how to reinforce the handle with rawhide strips cut from a deer he'd managed to kill. His hands blistered, then calloused, then blistered again in places the calluses didn't cover. His back screamed protests that he ignored because ignoring them was the only option. But, inch by inch, foot by foot, the dugout took shape. He excavated a main chamber 12 feet wide and 16 feet deep, with a ceiling just high enough for him to stand upright. The walls were hard-packed earth, stable enough to hold their shape without shoring in most places. Where the soil was looser, he reinforced it with woven willow branches plastered with clay from the creek bed. The entrance was the key to the whole design. He built it facing south, capturing winter sun while blocking north wind. More importantly, he built it with a slight overhang. Cottonwood logs laid horizontally to create a porch roof that extended 3 feet beyond the dugout entrance. Rain falling straight down would hit the overhang and drip harmlessly away. Only driving rain from the south could reach the entrance, and the prairie's worst storms almost always came from the north or west. Inside the dugout, he built racks, simple frames of cottonwood poles lashed together with willow bark that held firewood off the earthen floor. Air could circulate around the stacked wood, preventing the moisture buildup that caused rot and mold. The earth walls maintained a constant temperature of about 55 degrees, warm enough to prevent freezing, but cool enough to discourage insects and fungus. He finished the dugout on October 3rd and immediately began filling it with firewood. The neighbors thought he was crazy. There weren't many of them, perhaps a dozen families scattered across 50 square miles of prairie. But word traveled fast in country where human contact was rare enough to be noteworthy. By mid-October, everyone within a day's ride knew about the strange man from Ohio who had dug a hole in a hill to store his firewood. "You built a cellar for wood?" asked Thomas Greer, a rancher whose spread lay 5 miles to the south. He had ridden up one afternoon out of simple curiosity, unable to believe the stories he'd heard. "Like a root cellar, but for firewood." "Exactly like that," Marcus confirmed. He was splitting logs outside the dugout entrance, building his stockpile while the autumn weather held. "Wood needs to stay dry to burn properly. Underground stays dry." "But the labor," Greer said, shaking his head. 3 weeks of digging for a hole in the ground. You could have built a proper cabin in that time." "A cabin doesn't keep firewood dry. A cabin needs firewood to keep it warm. This is the foundation. The cabin comes next." Greer looked at the dugout entrance, at the neatly stacked wood visible in the shadows beyond, at the strange, solitary man who had appeared from nowhere and immediately started digging into the earth like a badger. "You're either very smart or very crazy," Greer said finally. "I haven't figured out which yet." "Give it until spring," Marcus replied. "Then you'll know." Other visitors were less polite. A group of young men from a settlement to the east rode by one November afternoon, hooting and hollering as they passed. "Hey, mole man, you living underground like a prairie dog?" "Must be nice, having a home that's already a grave. Save your family the trouble of digging." Marcus waved at them pleasantly and continued his work. He had heard worse from his own brother. Strangers' mockery was nothing by comparison. But one visitor was different. Her name was Clara Westbrook, a widow whose husband had died of cholera the previous spring, leaving her alone with a small homestead 3 miles to the west. She was perhaps 30 years old, weathered by grief and hard work, with intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and a practical mind that valued results over appearances. "I heard you built something unusual," she said, having ridden over on a gray mare that looked as tired as she did. "Something for storing firewood. I wanted to see it for myself." Marcus showed her the dugout, explaining the principles as he had explained them to Greer. The constant underground temperature, the drainage angle, the ventilation between stacked logs, the overhang that protected the entrance from rain. Clara listened without interrupting, her eyes moving from feature to feature, her mind clearly calculating something that Marcus couldn't see. "How much wood can it hold?" she asked when he finished. "About 4 cords, stacked properly. Enough to heat a cabin through a hard winter with some to spare." "And it stays dry? Truly dry, not just drier than outside?" "I've had wood in there for 3 weeks now. Check for yourself." Clara walked into the dugout and picked up a split log from the nearest rack. She examined it closely, sniffed it, rapped it against another log to hear the sound. Dry wood rang differently than wet wood, a clear, sharp crack rather than a dull thud. "It's dry," she said, something like wonder in her voice. "It's actually dry." "Told you." Clara set the log back in its place and turned to face him. "Mr. Dunbar, I've been burning wet wood for 6 months. My husband always handled the firewood, and I didn't realize how much work went into keeping it dry until he was gone. I've been cold every night since last winter, and I'm facing another winter with nothing but a canvas tarp between my wood pile and the weather." "I'm sorry to hear that." "I didn't come here for sympathy. I came here to ask if you would teach me to build one of these. A dugout for firewood. I'll pay you in whatever I have, eggs, milk, labor. I don't have money, but I can work." Marcus considered the woman standing before him. A stranger, yes, but a neighbor in a land where neighbors were precious. A person struggling to survive in circumstances that weren't so different from his own. "You don't need to pay me," he said. "I'll help you because it's the right thing to do. We can start tomorrow if you want." Clara's eyes glistened briefly before she blinked the moisture away. "Tomorrow," she agreed. "Thank you, Mr. Dunbar." "Marcus. Call me Marcus." "Thank you, Marcus." They built Clara's dugout over the following 2 weeks, working together in the cooling autumn weather. The labor went faster with 2 people, and Clara was stronger than she looked, handling a shovel with the efficiency of someone accustomed to hard work. She asked questions constantly, not idle chatter, but focused inquiries about technique and principle that showed she was learning, not just following. "Why do you angle the floor this way?" "So water flows out instead of pooling. Even a small puddle can rot your bottom row of wood." "And the racks? Why not just stack the wood on the floor?" "Air circulation. Wood needs air moving around it to stay dry. Stack it on the ground and the bottom layer never dries properly." By the time they finished, Clara understood the dugout system well enough to explain it to others, which she did. Within a month, 3 more families had approached Marcus about building their own firewood storage, and he had helped with each one, accepting payment in eggs and preserved meat, and labor that helped him finish his own cabin before the first hard freeze. The cabin was modest, a single room of cottonwood logs with a sod roof, and a stone fireplace that burned dry wood so efficiently that visitors commented on how little smoke rose from his chimney. It was warm and tight and comfortable, everything a man alone needed to survive a prairie winter. He had built it using techniques learned from his father, the same father who had left him only an axe while giving everything else to Cornelius. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Those skills, passed down through long days of working side by side, were worth more than any inheritance of land or livestock. Tools could be replaced. Knowledge couldn't be taken away. The fireplace was his particular pride. He had gathered stones from the creek bed, selecting each one for its shape and density, fitting them together with clay mortar that hardened in the fire's heat. The chimney drew perfectly because he had studied chimneys back in Ohio, had watched smoke patterns and felt drafts, and learned what made some fireplaces efficient and others smoky disasters. All of this knowledge, all of these skills, had been dismissed as worthless by a brother who couldn't see value in anything that didn't translate directly to profit. Cornelius had never understood that the ability to build something from nothing was more valuable than owning something already built. But Marcus found he wasn't alone as often as he'd expected. Clara visited regularly, bringing food she'd cooked and conversation that he'd forgotten he missed. Other neighbors stopped by, drawn by curiosity about his methods and staying for the warmth that his dry firewood provided. Even Thomas Greer admitted, grudgingly, that the dugout system seemed to be working. "Your wood's burning cleaner than mine," Greer observed during a December visit. "Less smoke, more heat. My wife keeps asking why our cabin's always cold when yours is always warm." "Build a dugout," Marcus suggested. "I'll help you." Maybe I will. Maybe I will at that. The winter of 1859 to 1860 was one of the harshest on record for the Nebraska Territory. Snow began falling in late November and didn't stop until March, burying the prairie under drifts that reached 10 feet in places. Temperatures dropped to 30 below zero for weeks at a time. The wind, always present, became a howling constant that drove men mad and killed livestock by the hundreds. Firewood consumption doubled, then tripled, as settlers fought to keep their homes warm enough to survive. Those with adequate supplies burned through them faster than expected. Those without adequate supplies faced impossible choices: burn furniture, burn fencing, burn the structural timbers of buildings that would collapse without them. And everywhere, the same complaint echoed across the frozen landscape. The wood was wet. Wood piles buried under snow absorbed moisture that turned to ice, then thawed near fires and filled cabins with smoke that made breathing difficult. Settlers who had gathered plenty of fuel found themselves unable to burn it properly, their fires sputtering and dying while the cold crept closer. Marcus Dunbar burned dry wood all winter. His dugout had kept his 4 cords perfectly preserved, protected from the snow and ice that plagued his neighbors. Each morning, he walked the short distance from his cabin to the dugout entrance, selected the logs he needed for the day, and carried them back to a fireplace that drew perfectly and burned clean. His cabin stayed warm while others shivered. His chimney stayed clear while others clogged with creosote. His health stayed strong while neighbors weakened from smoke inhalation and cold exposure. He thought often during those long winter nights about the difference that dry firewood made. It wasn't just about comfort, though comfort mattered more than people admitted. It was about efficiency. Dry wood produced more heat per log, which meant his stockpile lasted longer. It was about safety. Clean burning fires didn't build up the tar deposits that caused chimney fires. It was about health. Less smoke meant clearer air, fewer coughs, stronger lungs to fight off the illnesses that swept through frontier communities every winter. Such a simple thing, keeping wood dry. And yet it made the difference between thriving and barely surviving, between facing spring strong and facing it depleted. By February, the word had spread beyond his immediate neighbors to settlements across the region. People arrived asking questions, seeking advice, desperate to understand how one man had solved the problem that plagued everyone else. Marcus showed them all. He explained the principles, drew diagrams in the snow, walked them through the construction process step by step. He asked nothing in return, except that they share the knowledge with others who needed it. "Why do you do this?" Clara asked one evening in late February, sitting by his fireplace while another blizzard howled outside. They had grown close over the winter months, their practical cooperation gradually becoming something warmer. "You could charge for this. People would pay." "My family gave me nothing but an axe," Marcus replied, staring into the flames. "They threw me out with the clothes on my back and a tool that was only mine because my father promised it to me before he died. I came here with nothing, and I built something that works. That's worth more than money." "But if I charged, some people couldn't afford it. They'd go without, and they'd freeze, and their children would freeze with them. I won't have that on my conscience, not when sharing costs me nothing." Clara was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached over and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that needed no explanation. "You're a good man, Marcus Dunbar. Whatever your family thought of you, you're a good man." I'm trying to be. That's all any of us can do. Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow retreated, the creeks swelled with meltwater, and the prairie erupted in wildflowers that transformed the brown landscape into a carpet of color. Settlers emerged from their cabins blinking at the sunshine, counting their losses, beginning the work of rebuilding what winter had destroyed. The losses were significant. 17 people had died across the region, some from cold, some from illness, some from accidents caused by desperation. Livestock casualties numbered in the thousands. Buildings had collapsed, supplies had run out, and families had made impossible choices that would haunt them for years. But among those who had built dugouts for their firewood, the losses were minimal. Their dry fuel had burned efficiently all winter, keeping their homes warm with less wood than their neighbors had consumed. Their chimneys had stayed clear, preventing the fires that claimed 3 cabins elsewhere in the territory. Their health had stayed strong because they weren't breathing smoke for 6 months straight. Marcus counted 23 dugouts that had been built using his design. 23 families who had survived the worst winter in memory because they had dry firewood when everyone else was struggling with wet. Thomas Greer arrived in April, looking healthier than he had any right to look after such a winter. "I built that dugout," he said, shaking Marcus's hand with both of his. "Did it in November, just before the first big snow. My wife says it saved our lives, and I think she's right. I'm glad it helped." "Helped?" Greer laughed. "It did more than help. I've already had 6 people ask me to show them how to build one. We're going to have dugouts all over this territory by next winter." The prediction proved accurate. By the following autumn, more than 50 families had constructed firewood dugouts using Marcus's design. The technique spread through word of mouth, through letters to relatives back east, through newspaper articles that described the simple innovation and the remarkable man who had developed it. A professor from a college in Iowa made the journey in 1862, spending a week studying Marcus's dugout and documenting its principles. The resulting paper described the science behind the success, how underground temperatures remained constant, how the angled floor promoted drainage, how the ventilated racks prevented moisture accumulation. "You've essentially created a passive dehumidification system," the professor explained. "The Earth acts as a thermal buffer, maintaining conditions that are ideal for wood storage. It's quite brilliant, really." "It's just common sense," Marcus replied. "The Earth stays dry. Put your wood in the earth, your wood stays dry. Doesn't take a professor to figure that out." And yet no one else had figured it out. Not here, not anywhere that I've found in the literature. You solved a problem that people have been struggling with for centuries. Marcus shrugged. He had never thought of himself as an innovator or inventor. He had just needed dry firewood and had built something to make that happen. The fact that it worked better than anyone expected was a happy accident. Marcus and Clara married in the spring of 1861, a simple ceremony attended by neighbors who had become friends through shared struggle and mutual aid. They combined their homesteads, building a larger cabin on Marcus's land while maintaining Clara's property for additional farming and grazing. Their first child, a son they named William after Clara's late father, was born in 1862. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed in 1864. The family prospered in the way that prairie families could prosper. Not wealthy, but secure, with enough food and fuel and shelter to face each season without fear. The dugout that Marcus had built in his first desperate weeks continued to serve them, keeping firewood dry through winters that were sometimes harsh and sometimes mild, but always demanding. Word reached Marcus occasionally about his family back in Ohio. Cornelius had expanded the farm, taking on debt to buy additional acreage, confident that prices would continue rising. When prices fell instead, he'd lost everything. The original farm, the additional land, even the farmhouse where 3 generations of Dunbars had lived. Dorothy had left him then, returning to her own family with their 2 children, leaving Cornelius alone in a rented room in a town where everyone knew his failure. He died there in 1867, of drink and shame and a broken heart. Marcus felt nothing when he heard the news. No satisfaction, no grief, no sense of justice served. His brother had made choices and suffered consequences. That was all. The connection between them had been severed years ago, and Marcus had built a new life that owed nothing to the family that had discarded him. His children knew the story, of course, how their father had arrived in Nebraska with nothing but an axe, how he had built a dugout that kept his firewood dry, how that simple innovation had spread across the territory and helped dozens of families survive. They knew it as a tale of perseverance and ingenuity, of finding opportunity in adversity. What they didn't know, because Marcus never told them, was how close he had come to despair in those early weeks. How he had lain awake at night, wondering if he would survive the winter. How the loneliness had pressed down on him like a physical weight. He had survived not because he was special, but because he had refused to give up. He had solved problems one at a time, starting with the most basic: shelter, water, warmth, and building from there. The dugout wasn't genius. It was desperation channeled into action, nothing more. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. Marcus Dunbar lived until 1897, dying peacefully at the age of 72 in the cabin he had built with his own hands 38 years earlier. Clara survived him by 5 years, maintaining the homestead with help from their children and grandchildren until her own death in 1902. The property passed to William, who had inherited his father's practical nature and his mother's determination. The original dugout remained in use until 1923, when William's son finally replaced it with a modern storage building. By then, the techniques Marcus had pioneered had become standard practice across the Great Plains, so common that most people had forgotten they were ever innovations at all. Modern building science confirms what Marcus discovered through necessity and observation. Underground storage maintains stable temperature and humidity conditions that are ideal for firewood preservation. Properly constructed dugouts can keep wood dry for years, eliminating the moisture problems that reduce burning efficiency and increase dangerous creosote buildup. The principles apply beyond firewood, of course. Root cellars, storm shelters, wine caves, and countless other structures use the same basic understanding of how Earth buffers environmental extremes. Marcus didn't invent underground storage. People had been using it for thousands of years. But he applied it to a specific problem in a specific environment where no one else had thought to try. His grave marker, in a small cemetery overlooking the creek where he first made camp, bears an inscription chosen by Clara before her own death. He came with nothing but an axe. He left a legacy of warmth. The prairie wind still blows across that cemetery, ceaseless and indifferent. The same wind that Marcus faced when he arrived with nothing, and the same wind that his descendants still feel when they visit his grave. It's a reminder that the land doesn't care about human struggles, doesn't reward virtue or punish vice, doesn't offer anything except raw material for those willing to work with it. Marcus Dunbar was willing. He took an axe and turned it into a life, took rejection and turned it into resilience, took a hole in the ground and turned it into a solution that helped hundreds of families survive. His family had given him nothing but an axe. He had given himself everything else.